This scary story happened in a fishing village in China a few years ago. There was a woman who had been waiting for someone under the lighthouse at the pier for 7 days. She was the wife of Fang, a fisherman. On the day Fang set sail, his boat was suddenly hit by a storm and had not returned for 7 days. Although her son advised her to return home, the wife still waited there. Fang's wife had been waiting on the pier for 7 days now. Each time she was dragged home by her son to stop waiting. This village was a typical fishing village of Fujian province, China. The people were all fishing on the sea, so sometimes shipwrecks were inevitable. Finally, the bad news came on the 8th day. The son then panicked and ran to the reporter to tell his mother that he had seen Fang's body washed up on the beach. The wife had already guessed the outcome, but in her heart she still hoped that her husband would return safely. Fang's body was soaked in water for a long time, so it looked terrible when it washed up on the beach. Fang's corpse was densely covered with sea creatures such as sea clams and conches. These often attached themselves to dead bodies in the sea. The people saw this and immediately helped clean Fang's body from sea clams and conch and brought his body home for burial. Those sea snails adhered to the skin of the decomposing corpse. When the people pulled the snail out with his hand, the snail would bring a piece of meat or skin from the corpse. The people made great efforts to help. People brought the body back to the village, prepared it for burial. Most people in shipwrecks died in such a tragic way. Sea clams and conch were removed from Fang's corpse still on the beach. After dark, a group of young people was walking by the beach. The sea was extremely cool but contained many dangers and death. These 3 young people all worked in town and turned back to the village at night to rest. That day they invited each other to go out to relieve stress. One of the groups, Han, found the sea clams and conches scattered on the beach. The group didn't know where the sea clams and conch came from, but these conches looked delicious. The rest of the group said, "These people are a waste. These delicious big conch are thrown here. This thing is a real bargain." So the whole group packed those snails and prepared them to bring home to cook and eat. The group did not forget to laugh happily because they accidentally caught delicious bait. The sky suddenly became pitch black, and clouds were gathering in the evening. The houses near the sea were quiet. The group went home to cook snails and make some small dishes, and then they started drinking. People lived near the sea that had one thing in common. They knew that the meat of this conch was very tender and juicy. This conch was large and had lots of meat. The young men pulled out the snail meat with a small toothpick. The snail was completely separated from the shell. The appearance was a little scary, but the meat was delicious. The conch was an expensive food in the city, therefore these young people couldn't ignore the immediate benefit. The group of young people used toothpicks to get the snail meat and ate happily. They looked like they were eating well. But only Han didn't eat any snails. "Why don't you eat it?" a young man asked Han. "I'm allergic to snails, so I can't try. You guys just eat it. I was scared when I looked at it," Han said. So the 2 remaining people gossiped and quickly ate all the conch. After eating, the group went to bed because it was past midnight. Because 3 young men were tired and had a little yeast in them, they slept soundly. Han also quickly fell asleep because he was too tired. Just sleeping for a while, Han was suddenly woken up by terrible screams. He still couldn't figure out where these screams were coming from because he was still sleepy. It turned out that one of his co-workers was sick. But isn't he sick? Han saw that person writhing in pain, his whole body arched, his whole body covered in a deadly gray. His stomach felt like something was moving. His belly was gradually bulging high, bulging like a pregnant woman. His belly was constantly expanding, the underbelly was twisting back and forth, looking very scary. Han was frightened by the sight and immediately went to his friend's bed to help him. At that time, there were also screams of pain from behind. Han wondered what had happened again. Han looked back. His other friend was also in great pain, to the point of kneeling on the bed. His whole body had blue veins, so painful that he gnashed his teeth as if he couldn't stand it anymore. Han did not dare to delay when he saw the situation. He immediately ran out to find a doctor. After a while, Han found a doctor who had been working in the village for more than 30 years. When the doctor arrived, Han's two friends passed out from the pain. The two of them looked like they were dead. Han looked at them with fear. The doctor said they had eaten something unclean. That was why it happened. Han told the doctor about these two eating the conches tonight. "We picked up some conch and mussels today. The two of them ate them," Han told the doctor. After listening, the doctor told Han about the terrible origin of those conches. Han's face paled from fear. The doctor said that conch and mussels were the things that contained the evilest spirits in the sea. They like to suck the yin gas of the dead. If we eat them a lot, they would be very harmful to our health. After that, the doctor went to get a bunch of sticky rice to soak in water. This way was a cure for conch poisoning. The doctor asked Han to give his water to his friends to drink so two friends could recover from their illness. After being poured a lot of sticky rice water into their mouths, the other two started vomiting madly. The scary thing was that the spit out conch meat was not completely digested, still intact with the shape of the conch. In ancient times, it was believed that conches and sea mussels could absorb yin and form pearls. Most sea snails and mussels were not very clean creatures at all. Dr. Chan was well known in the area for his healing skills and knowledge of all diseases. One day, he received a very serious invitation from a farmer's house in the village. Following the tour guide, he walked for more than 20 minutes to reach the place. According to the guide, his father seemed to be in a critical condition. "Hurry up, doctor. My father can't take it anymore." Arriving in front of the house, the man opened the old gate and invited Dr. Chan inside. As he led the doctor inside, he hurriedly called out to his mother. "Mother, I invited Dr. Chan to come here." The mother had just come out, repeatedly urging him in because she was afraid that her husband's condition would not make him last long. The mother invited Dr. Chan inside while talking about her husband's situation. Her husband just got sick 2 days ago and was getting worse very quickly. The person lying on the bed was an older man with a pale face and wide open mouth and eyes rolled backwards. Dr. Chan approached to examine the man's situation. The older man rolled his eyes, panicking and continuously shouting, "It hurts so much. They are crawling all over me. Please kill me. I'm in so much pain." A blanket covered the older man, so Dr. Chan didn't know what the man's problem was. So Dr. Chan decided to come and see what was under the blanket. But when he approached, the man strongly reacted to Dr. Chan. He pushed Dr. Chan away. It seemed that the disease had made the man panic and no longer aware of his surroundings. But with his years of experience, Dr. Chan quickly convinced the man to be examined. Despite following the doctor's orders, the older man still seemed to be very uncomfortable and afraid. As soon as he lifted the blanket, Dr. Chan was amazed to see the patient's current condition. The older man's belly was monstrously bulged. Suddenly, the older man appeared to be in pain, as if just moving could make his whole body suffer. Dr. Chan now seemed to understand the older man's condition, so he told the older man's son and wife to hold him tightly. Both of them joined forces to be able to hold the older man down, even though he was struggling with pain. After the older man was held tightly, Dr. Chan unbuttoned the older man's shirt, revealing a tight, swollen abdomen full of veins and blood. Dr. Chan now looked thoughtfully at the large and protruding belly of what looked like tendons. They were all very large and swollen on the skin of the older man's abdomen. But strangely, these tendons could move, or rather, it looked like worms or parasites inside of him. Dr. Chan seemed to have understood the problem. He turned to take out the acupuncture needles from the toolbox. The needles were long and sharp, but Dr. Chan believed that they could definitely help the older man now. Dr. Chan just stopped thinking for a moment, then started his treatment. Acupuncture needles were inserted into the older man's belly in sequence. Dr. Chan was very good at this acupuncture method. After a while, acupuncture needles were quickly inserted all over the man's belly, and the things that looked like worms also started to stop moving. And a few minutes later, they disappeared completely, no longer visible on the skin of the older man's belly. The older man now also began to calm down, feeling less pain, and was able to rest for a while. The son seemed very worried about his father. He hurriedly asked Dr. Chan what strange illness his father was suffering from. Dr. Chan did not talk directly about the disease at this time, but he began to learn more about the time the older man got sick. Dr. Chan said to the son, "Your father had been infected with a type of poisonous parasite. If left for any longer, it would consume all of his organs. The situation is very dire." The son asked Dr. Chan if his father would be saved. The wife also said that her husband suddenly became strange a few days ago after cutting grass to feed the cows. That's when he began to feel sick. Upon hearing that, Dr. Chan quickly asked her about the location of the lawn, as he wanted the patient's family to lead him there to check it out and inspect. According to his mother's description, the son also knew the location of the lawn area. By the time it was getting dark, the son had already started taking Dr. Chan because it was around wild grass growing relatively far from their home. On the way, the son still didn't understand why his father's illness had something to do with the wild grass. But Dr. Chan still didn't explain anything. He had his own conclusions. After walking quite a distance, the son said they were almost there. They just have to go behind the cliff and they would arrive. When he arrived, Dr. Chan was amazed and also afraid. It seemed that his suspicions were correct. In front of them was a bunch of weeds, as tall as people and at first glance, as normal as any other type of weed. Dr. Chan and the son started to walk closer to the grassy area. The doctor was extremely wary, but the son didn't know what was going on. Dr. Chan walked and looked around like he was looking for something. Finally, he found what he was looking for. Seeing that they had been gone for quite a long time from home, and with the doctor being extremely quiet without telling him about his father's condition, the son began to worry. At this point, Dr. Chan began to explain to the son the cause of the appearance of the parasites. A parasite caused his father's illness. They were infecting and sucking blood from his father's belly fat. The parasite was born from a strange worm, and it only reproduced on this type of weed. After that, Dr. Chan started rummaging through his tool bag. The son still didn't understand what Dr. Chan was going to do. Then Dr. Chan gave the son a thick scarf that looked like it was sewn with many layers. The two began to approach the weeds, and Dr. Chan needed to experiment a bit to be sure to find something that could treat the patient. After a while of searching, Dr. Chan reached out and picked a branch of the tree which grew among the weeds. Indeed, if they looked at it with the naked eye, it would be difficult to distinguish this plant in the middle of a vast lawn. Even the son was very surprised. Dr. Chan held up the branch high and asked the son to look closely above the small leaves, which were the eggs of the parasites. At this point, the son was starting to get scared but still wanted to know what it was, so he also looked at the leaf. And indeed, on the surface of the leaves, there were some seeds, tiny as white as a grain of rice. When he tried to take a closer look, the son suddenly realized that they were eggs and covered with thin membrane-like spider silk. The son wondered, this thing was so small, how could it cause such a terrible disease? Dr. Chan didn't explain much. He just asked the son to take a good look at what he does next. Dr. Chan rummaged through his pocket and pulled out a small vial. Then he gave it to the son, telling him to apply it on his face and hands. Applying this drug would help avoid insects, even those parasitic larvae that attack the body. After that, Dr. Chan started going deep into the grass, like he was looking for something. The weeds around here were taller than a person's head, so there was a lot of potential for danger. In the end, it seemed that Dr. Chan had found something important that could help cure the older man's illness. After reaching out to pick a tree branch, Dr. Chan showed it to the son. There were many small purple fruits on the branch, which looked very strange. Dr. Chan held it out in front of the son and told him to look for more fruits like this. It grew from the same tree on which the poisonous parasites lay their eggs. Dr. Chan told him to look carefully and pick a lot to bring back to save his father. The two began to split up to find and pick the strange fruit which only reproduced on this plant, and only its fruit could kill those parasites. In just a moment, the two were able to pick a lot of fruit. After getting out of the weeds, Dr. Chan suddenly took a small knife and cut a small cut on his finger. The son was extremely surprised but still very quiet, watching Dr. Chan. Next, Dr. Chan began to drip his own blood from the cut. The drop of blood fell directly onto the leaf containing the small larva eggs. At this moment, the son was putting the leaf on the handkerchief and holding it in his hand. What happened next made him extremely scared. After the drop of blood permeated the egg sacs, they seemed to begin to move. From within the tiny eggs, strange creatures looking like small worms began to break the egg sac and came out. At first, they were just bigger than a thread, but after they sucked all the blood on the leaf, they suddenly became as big as chopsticks. They gradually got bigger and bigger. In an instant, they almost filled out the entire handkerchief the son was holding, making him shiver with fear. At that moment, Dr. Chan took the purple fruit he had just picked. He gently squeezed the fruit and it immediately oozed a purple liquid. After that, he directly dripped it onto a parasite. Miraculously, the purple juice from the wild fruit worked. The poisonous parasite began to writhe in pain and then withered and died. Seeing these things, the son also understood what the doctor wanted to say. Suddenly, Dr. Chan seemed to remember something. He glanced at these weeds and thought for a moment. But now, it was getting dark. They needed to go home with this pile of purple fruit quickly. The doctor did not forget to ask the son if anyone had known this lawn area, and Dr. Chan began to worry when he looked closely at the weeds behind him. He was worried that if he continued to leave this lawn and this dangerous plant here, more people would be harmed. So Dr. Chan asked more carefully if this land was owned by anyone or not. Because the older man's condition was critical, they didn't talk much but quickly went home to treat him. Arriving home, Dr. Chan gave the bunch of plants to the wife and told her to get a basin and squeeze all the juice of these purple fruits into it. After squeezing the juice, Dr. Chan began to pull out all the needles that had been inserted into the older man's belly in the first place. Within those purple fruits seemed to be a lot of liquid, so a full basin was squeezed out. Dr. Chan said to the wife, "Take this wet towel and wipe your husband all over his body." This method would cause pain to the parasites and was intended to force the parasites out of the patient. Following Dr. Chan's instructions, the wife quickly wiped it all over her husband, and then they allowed a few minutes so that the purple juice could penetrate the skin. A few minutes later, when the time came, Dr. Chan held a small scalpel. He cut an extended cut on the patient's wrist. This would be the way for the parasites to escape. And yes, after the purple water had penetrated into the skin, the parasites began to ache and increasingly wiggle beneath the older man's skin. They were crawling around and seemed to be looking for a way to get out. The sight was terrifying. Witnessing what happened in front of their eyes, the wife was terrified, wondering if her husband could stand it. Seeing that Dr. Chan tried his best to comfort her, everything would be resolved soon. At this point, the parasites began to appear all over the older man's body. It turned out that they had proliferated a lot in his stomach and were now trying to crawl out. The parasites eventually discovered the cut on the older man's wrist, so they started making their way there. In an instant, they began to crawl out from the wound on the older man's wrist. The scene was gruesome. Long parasites like worms were jostling to escape the older man's body. At a glance, these parasites were fat and red. It seemed that they had sucked a lot of blood from the older man's body. And after only a few minutes, all the parasites came out from the mouth of the wound. Underneath the floor, Dr. Chan also left a basin of purple fruit juice, so they fell straight into it. The purple juice began to work, directly killing those fat parasites. They withered and decomposed utterly, leaving only a pungent stench like the smell of carrion. After the parasites had all escaped, the older man's body started returning to normal. Dr. Chan turned back and informed the son and his mother that his father was out of danger. Dr. Chan advised a few more things to take better care of the older man. After a few days of rest, he would get better. After that, Dr. Chan also said goodbye to the older man's family because he needed to handle something important. Because he already had a plan in mind, Dr. Chan decided to deal with this problem decisively. Otherwise, many more people would be harmed by this poisonous parasite. That night, Dr. Chan walked towards the weed area in the afternoon. He lit a fire and burned it all. He hoped that no one would be accidentally infected with this blood-sucking parasite ever again. It was a strange story that happened that made my whole village stir and bewildered for a long time. The story happened on a day in late summer, early autumn, when my whole village sank into the inherent peace. There was a family that encountered a bad thing. At that time, the wife was busy preparing food in the kitchen. Suddenly, realizing that the vegetables were running out, then she asked her husband to go down to the warehouse to pick more vegetables. The husband listened to his wife's words, leisurely entered the house, smoked a cigarette, and walked towards the warehouse. Since then, his family had lived by farming, so the house always built a warehouse to store harvested vegetables. Usually the family's food reserves were kept in a secret cellar that only family members knew. This thing was a habit that had been passed down through generations in the house. As usual, the husband went straight to the mouth of the tunnel, slowly crouched down. He opened the lid, looked inside and briefly checked it because it was a place to store food, but few people frequented it, so there were often rats and a few reptiles living there. After feeling safe, the husband followed the vertical ladder placed close to the foundation and went down to the basement. The whole basement without light became extremely dark, but it made few strange noises that made the husband curious and look around. As soon as he arrived, he immediately panicked because he saw a flock of colorful poisonous snakes wiggling on the ground, eyes wide open looking at him. The husband had never seen the strange snake before, so he panicked and shouted and clung to the ladder, looking for a way up. The snake saw the husband run away and immediately chased after him. They slithered in long rows close to his heels, causing him to panic, constantly calling his wife to help. The wife heard her husband's voice, immediately put aside the cooking, hurriedly ran to her husband to check it out. Looking at the panicked expression on her husband's face, the wife felt extremely worried and then asked him about what had happened. Even though the husband had reached a safe place, he was still afraid in his heart. He kept telling his wife that he encountered a herd of snakes under the basement, surprising her. The wife found it hard to understand because there had been no snake that could sneak into the family's basement since then. To be sure, she also actively went to the place to check. The husband immediately stepped back and pointed to the mouth of the basement, which had not yet been closed. He told his wife to calm down because the number of snakes below was many, possibly up to a dozen. The wife was very confident at first, but when she approached the mouth of the basement, she heard a noise below and began to feel uneasy in her heart. She cautiously looked down at the mouth of the basement to check if there were snakes like her husband said. Indeed, the scene unfolding before her eyes made her scream. With her own eyes, she had seen the small snakes squirming together in the dark basement, which she did not know before. Not only that, but these snakes are also very aggressive. The snakes saw the wife looking at them, immediately jumped up, bared their venomous fangs to scare the wife into shock. The husband saw that and went to his wife, hugged her. Both of them thought together about how to deal with the crowd of snakes below. The husband was very reckless at first, pulled up his sleeves and then went straight to the basement, wanting to catch each snake by himself. The wife saw this and immediately went to stop her husband for fear that he was in danger. After that, she pondered for a while and then asked her husband to light a large torch to bring in. The husband listened to his wife, immediately went out and turned back with a big torch. When he reached the mouth of the basement, the husband threw the burning torch down from above, burning down dozens of snakes below. The light from the fire on the torch illuminated the entire basement, revealing the space inside. From the bottom rose a thick smoky grey smoke with an unpleasant odor. The higher the smoke rose, the more it would change into a thick grey black, as big as a large tornado, creeping through the door frames of the house, flying out and disappearing into the air. After the smoke cleared, the couple hugged each other and crept back to the basement to check the movement, but everything seemed to have become quieter. The husband slowly looked down. At this time, the husband breathed a sigh of relief and told his wife everything was fine. He did not see a snake anymore. After everything was resolved, the husband immediately told his wife to continue her work and he would go down to the basement to pick up food for his wife. The husband had just arrived at the place. The worry about the snakes earlier rose in him. The husband saw this. immediately looked for a wooden stick and then slowly went deep, his eyes constantly looking around. The sound of his footsteps echoed throughout the basement, creating an uncomfortably tense atmosphere. He carefully checked every nook and cranny of the basement so as not to miss a single snake. Suddenly, he was caught by a rustling sound. He walked to the source of the sound, raised a wooden stick, held it tightly and slowly walked over to check. As he approached, the husband saw a large white snake curled up in the corner of the room, hiding behind the family's food baskets. The husband saw the scene and panicked and shouted. Reflexively, he kept raising the wooden stick and slamming it down. In the first hit, the white snake was fortunate to dodge, but on the second hit, the wooden stick hit the white snake's head, causing red blood to splash. The snake then lay dead on the ground, surrounded by the blood that made the husband dumbfounded. He looked in horror at the snake's large body lying in front of him and quickly handled it, then turned back up. At this time, he felt tired in his body, so he went to bed to rest. But in the evening, the husband kept lying on the bed no matter how much his wife and children called. He refused to get up to eat. The husband stayed like that until the following morning, making his wife feel both strange and worried. The wife planned to go to the market to buy some things, but she felt insecure as soon as she got out of the house. She decided to return home immediately, running into the room to wake the husband up. After a while, when the husband did not answer, the wife jerked the blanket off to check. At this time, the wife panicked when she saw her husband lying motionless on the bed with his body curled up like a snake, looking very scary. The wife saw the horror scene and screamed and quickly ran out. Suddenly, she remembered her husband's story of killing snakes and thought of an idea. So, she went to invite the best magician in the village to come to help her heal her husband. She alone brought the magician into the house. As soon as the magician reached the courtyard, his heart suddenly appeared a sense of uneasiness. He followed the wife into the bedroom to check. The wife did not expect the situation to become so serious. Based on the celestial eye, the magician saw the spirit of the white snake wrapping around the husband's body, waiting for the day to eat the meat. The magician did not rush to conclusions, so he turned to ask the wife if there were snakes in the house recently. Hearing that, the wife also nodded to confirm. She told the story about the snakes in the basement yesterday to the magician. After listening, the magician sighed, saying that the family had accidentally killed the white snake, a dangerous snake. When the wife heard it, she panicked, cried, and begged the magician to save the life of her husband and the whole family. The magician saw that the wife was also pitiful, so he immediately thought of a way to help this poor family. After pondering for a while, the magician also told the wife that the white snake was very angry now. It was difficult to forgive her and her husband, but there was only one way that could help them. So the magician asked the wife to lead him down to the basement where the white snake and his children had lived to build an altar. The wife was busy helping the magician with a hand, preparing a large respectful altar to apologize to the white snake. The magician, after preparing the altar, also began to bless and worship and then left. Before leaving, he still did not forget to instruct the wife every year on this day to celebrate the death anniversary of the white snake and regularly worship and beg for the white snake to forgive her sins. The husband soon regained consciousness, but his spirit was broken and weak. Listening to his wife tell everything, he was also very repentant, going to the white snake altar alone to apologize. Since then, the food storage basement in the house has become a place to worship the white snakes, and the altar is always full of incense and food. December 1989, the event occurred in Hong Kong's North District, which was an international municipality in the New Territories. There was an old restaurant called Kong Cha that specialized in various types of appealing cuisine, but generally only offered char siu, rice and pho. Another day, Sheng, a young guy working at the restaurant, received a call to order food for 4 people, including pho and grilled pork rice with eggs. "It's at number C, building B in the Garden Plaza, isn't it? Okay, I'll deliver it to you right now." Sheng instantly grabbed a pen and notepad to jot down the address. He then proceeded to deliver food to clients. This address wasn't difficult to find, so Sheng didn't have to spend too much time to look for it. It was an ancient building, it was chilly, and appeared like it hadn't been occupied in a long time. When he arrived at the correct address, he raised his hand and rang the doorbell. A blast of wind blew, sending shivers down his spine. But the doorbell rang for a long time. No one opened the door, and the posters strewn in front of the door indicated that this home had appeared to be abandoned for a long time. Sheng rang the doorbell many times more, but no one replied or opened the door. Sheng wondered if he had misspelled the address, since the restaurant had been quite busy before. Thinking he'd been scammed, he turned his back to return to the restaurant, but as he did, a voice in the room sounded from behind Sheng. It sounded like someone was attempting to open the door. He thought he heard a voice, but it was foggy and indistinct. The door suddenly opened with a creak, accompanied by a terrible sound made Sheng nervous. The door was opened to expose a small gap, but the interior was so dark that Sheng couldn't see what was inside. The person inside only spoke in a low, raspy voice and very slightly opened the door, as though no one was permitted to peek inside. Then that person handed a banknote through the gap of the door. This person's hand was really odd. Even though the person opened the door slightly and placed the money outside, Sheng couldn't see who it was. It appeared to be a male. Sheng carefully examined the note. There was no issue. Sheng thought the man was strange when he instructed him to leave the meal at the door. That night, the restaurant was being cleaned up and getting ready to close. While auditing the income and expenses for the day, the owner noticed something odd. He discovered a just paper among real money. He had no idea where this note originated from, but it made him feel extremely uneasy. Who is taking part in this game? Why is there a just paper here? Mr. Lee displayed the note to the employees and cautioned them. He suspected that real money had been switched for just paper. He tried to mention it aloud so that the staff wouldn't do it again, but he became enraged and tossed the just paper in the garbage. The next day, an order for dinner came from that address again, and they ordered the restaurant to serve them the same meal as yesterday. The owner promptly confirmed the order and asked Sheng to continue delivering. However, the situation with food delivery remained same from yesterday. Money was still given through the door gap, and food was still requested to be put at the door. The people inside were still not revealing themselves.
Who did it? Do you think I'm a moron?
The owner's voice continued to yell loudly. The reason was that he spotted a just paper again at night. Seeing the boss was so upset, Sheng then informed him about the unusual food delivery to that address. For a long time, the owner reasoned that if the residents in that house continued to order meals from the restaurant, he would find out the truth. The next day, as predicted, there was an order from that address again. The owner personally delivered the meal to the location and received the cash from the door gap. He picked up the bill and carefully examined it, flipping it back and forth, but he couldn't see anything suspicious about it. The owner, like Sheng, placed food at the door. He hastily grabbed the money and departed, his face now full of contemplation mixed with bewilderment. Returning to the store, he placed the money aside this time to observe if anything odd happened, in order to prevent the same misunderstanding as the previous 2 times. After the owner had completed calculating other income, he glanced at the bills in the evening, but what he saw shocked him. This occurrence terrified him so much that he dropped his cigarette and his mouth wide open as if he had witnessed something awful. Those seemingly regular money notes he had placed in a different corner of the table had now been transformed into joss papers once more. The owner was so terrified that he yelled to the police in a quivering voice, "Police! It's me! Something awful has occurred. Please be here as soon as possible." Following to what the owner said, the police hurried to the location, but they discovered that the doorbell was entirely broken and no one came to open the door. The cops had to use force to smash the door down. However, once inside, they discovered that the door was locked from the inside, but the horrifying image in front of their eyes caused them all to fear. There was a mahjong table in the middle of the room and some dead people next to it. They died in a big puddle of dried blood. These people had been dead for a long time, and their corpses had shrunk, leaving just dry skeletons, and their flesh had disintegrated. Based on the conditions at the site, they were most likely using a coal burner in the room to keep warm, but ended up inhaling poisonous gas. Because these people lived very private lives and didn't interact with anyone, no one discovered their bodies. But the empty lunchboxes littered throughout the room gave the cops pause, because everyone in the room was dead. So, who ate the food? These corpses were discovered and transported to the mortuary for forensic testing, confirming that they had been dead for more than a week, although the food in their stomachs had only been there for 2 days, which was rice and fur. The test findings astounded the whole Hong Kong police force. The dead man's fingerprints were also discovered on Mr. Lee's joss papers. Soon after, this odd event traveled across Hong Kong and was published by various media outlets. The occurrence became a riddle that the police could not solve. It had become the Hong Kong's police's sole publicly acknowledged super mysterious case in decades. According to the Feng Shui shaman, the spirits of the dead could not leave the building where the incident occurred since there was no sunshine, so they constantly felt they were still alive, and sometimes people still could hear them. That room was filled with the sound of mahjong players. In 1991, it occurred in Sha Tin, Hong Kong. After graduating from secondary school, I didn't have a job and was just wandering around all day, so my father sent me to a distant relative's house to learn how to paint professionally. It was actually about making paper people, paper horses and paper structures. In a nutshell, it was a collection of paper objects used for burning. Because this was a profession associated with the dead, many people found it unappealing at first. I was no exception, but after more than a year of study, my perspective had shifted dramatically. First and foremost, this was a primary source of income for my family, with some colored paper and dried rice stalks that could be sold for money, and it was a highly skilled industry. And my master, I'm not sure what to say about him, but he was very well known within 10 miles and 8 villages nearby. He was a great teacher to me and taught me many things. My master and I moved a few large paper animals out of the house one morning in September to make room. My master was also very familiar with the funeral process, and he was frequently invited to perform funeral rites. But before he left, he told me that the finished paper people should never have their faces painted because the paper people would become spiritual. Drawing souls was the term used in the paper drawing industry to describe craftsmen who used color to draw the facial features of a person on the paper ones. I believed it was because he was afraid I would make an ugly face and waste my time, so I didn't care too much, and I was afraid the master would nag me, so I continued to work at home. The majority of people were afraid to enter the paper shop. Actually, after I got used to it, I preferred to be alone and work faster. I shaped the hot oil-soaked cornstarch into a man's skeleton, and it was quickly assembled. A palm tree leaf stalk soaked in hot oil was not only strong, but also difficult to break, making it very convenient and flexible. The wire connecting the paper body had to be made of castor fiber. These things hadn't been too sloppy under the master's supervision. The master frequently stated that in this profession, you shouldn't deceive people because there were ghosts. It was easy to deceive people, but it was not easy to deceive ghosts. These materials were typically prepared by the master himself, and all I could do was follow. In our industry, the paper used to be put on the frame was referred to as leather, which referred to the type of skin that was glued to the paper body. All good leather was made of dried straw. No glue was used in the manufacturing of plaster, which was made from flour and glutinous rice puree. The ratio of water to flour, as well as the temperature, were critical for ensuring flexibility. Although many people were no longer interested in this ancient craft, my master was always interested in it. Even though I could disagree with him, I still greatly respected him. After more than a year of study, I had mastered all of these things. It took me half a morning, and while I couldn't see the sophistication of the skeleton inside, the outer appearance was nearly identical to what the master would have done. I took out a pencil case from the drawer to color the paper man, and I wanted to draw him wearing clothes. I was facing the paper man at the time, but I suddenly felt eyes staring at me behind the desk. I looked back, and only the paper man was there. I discovered that the master's brush set was specially designed for drawing people and creating their souls on paper. At that precise moment, an idea occurred to me. The color of the sky outside was gradually darkening by this point. Master had yet to return. Perhaps he forgot about time because he had been invited to drink. But after a long struggle, I gave up the thoughts in my heart, not wanting to irritate my master. It was already 10 o'clock at night, and the master hadn't returned, and when I looked at the paper people in the room, I got a strange feeling in my heart. I had some issues like that. I couldn't forget an idea that had formed in my mind. I always wanted to do it. My master would never let me do this, so this was a good chance for me to show it off. So I began to draw souls for the paper people cautiously. Actually, I enjoyed writing and drawing, so I believed I could draw very well. It was just if the drawing was bad, the master would consider it a waste of time, so I was very careful. I finished my first paper man nervously, and it was a huge success. I became more daring and quickly drew the second paper person. The only thing I didn't understand was why there was so much red in the master's color box. When I finished, I looked at my masterpiece and saw that it was as good as the paper man made by the master. Speaking of the soulful paper man, I believed it was even more beautiful than his paper man. Everything had been cleaned up, but the master hadn't returned. He surely had been too drunk, so I went to bed first. At first, I couldn't sleep well because I was always worried about when the master would return to open the door for him. But my eyelids didn't listen to my body, and I fell asleep without realizing it when I lay down. Perhaps I had a good night's sleep as well, because I heard people walking around. The sound was very strange. It appeared that someone had walked around in front of the door, and the sound of paper rubbing could be heard from time to time. I sat up, and there was a noise on the bed, followed by a sound in front of the door. I thought, that's strange. Was that my fantasy? I checked the pendulum clock on the table. It was past 12 o'clock at night. I was afraid it was the teacher returning drunk and unsteadily, causing damage from outside. So I got up and went outside to see. But what struck me as odd was that there was no one outside, and I couldn't figure out where the voice was coming from. I opened the door once more and looked out into the courtyard to see if there was anything there. However, the yard was also empty. Master may have drank too much and slept in an acquaintance's house. He was unlikely to return tonight. It appeared that the sound I just heard was a dream, because I was dreaming at the time. However, the light in the room enabled me to see a black shadow rushing towards me, and behind me appeared a man holding a wooden stick. Before I could get a better look, a wooden stick smacked me across the head. I couldn't figure out what was going on because of the surprise attack. It was only then that I reluctantly pushed myself up, looking back to see who had hit me. But when I saw it clearly, it made my head spin. How could it do this? In front of me stood the paper man I just made today, a man made of paper with skeletons made of palm leaf stalks and straw paper. How was the paper man in front of me able to move? And he even wanted to kill me with that stick he was holding. I couldn't care less about it right now, so I backed away as quickly as I could, avoiding the club that kept swinging downwards. But at that precise moment my hand came into contact with something, a sickle used to cut rice. I desperately waved the sickle forward, cutting a long hole in the paperman's thigh. The paperman's movements came to a halt, but I was terrified on the inside, as if my masterpiece was being destroyed by myself. Those skeletons made of palm leaf stalks and parchment skins were entirely my own creation. I was in a state of shock at the time. I'm not sure where I got such ridiculous ideas. The man in front of me was about to suffocate me. While I was still dazed, the paperman suddenly rushed forwards towards me, perhaps because I drew too much. The paperman at the time appeared to be a real person, which was very strange. I immediately threw those ridiculous ideas out the window and continued to wave my sickle forward. Because the crescent was so sharp, I could see it had cut a few holes in the paperman's body. Despite the fact that all of the skin had been ripped and brushed, skeletons inside had been cut open. The paperman's movements continued. The paperman lunged in front of me in the blink of an eye, a large stick in his hand raised towards me. I was helpless to resist. All I could do was close my eyes and wait for the stick to fall. But at that moment I felt a light in front of me and heat spreading. When I opened my eyes, there was a burning paperman in front of me with a torch through its chest. There was a figure standing behind the blazing light and raging flames, holding a torch. When the master returned, he saw my situation and used torches to relieve my siege. When I saw my master return, I just wanted to tell him what had happened, but he abruptly stopped me when I said, "Teacher, just now it became completely real."
Bring out all the paper people.
To avoid a disaster, the master directed that I immediately burn all of the paper people that I had made today. The fruits of my day's labor turned into a raging fire in the blink of an eye. But after witnessing the heinous appearance of the recently resurrected paperman, I felt compelled to burn it all down. The master asked why paper people had become real and why I had given them a soul. It turned out the story has a long history and many ancient secrets. This drawing soul is even a never-ending anecdote. If you draw the paperman too much like a human, he will have a soul. The paperman only needed bones, and their responsibility was to replace the souls of the dead, so the paperman couldn't have a soul. In the master's chalk box, there was a red color made of rooster blood powder mixed with cinnabar that could only be lit at the last moment when the paperman and paper horse were about to be burned. That was how it ended. I'm still learning craft techniques from the master. I'm still doing this job, but I have a lot of respect for the people who came before me. I've seen a lot of strange things these days in this business, which was known as doing business with the living during the day and doing business with the dead at night. The story took place on July 21, 2010 in Taiwan in a commercial and residential building known as Zushi Tiansha. The fifth floor of this building was a nursing house for mildly mentally ill patients, while the remaining floors were apartments and offices. 7 days ago, an elderly woman named Lee, who was being treated in the hospital on the fifth floor, went missing, and her family searched for days but couldn't find her. That afternoon, an elderly man was returning to his apartment on the 7th floor of the Zushi Tiansha building. Because he had only one daughter and was married, the elderly man lived alone on the 7th floor. When the elevator doors opened, the old man entered to go upstairs as usual, but he discovered that it was occupied by an elderly woman, but she didn't exit. The old man didn't think much of it, despite the fact that it was strange. She became even more bizarre after entering because she did not press to select any floor. It could have been a confused woman or a mental patient on the 5th floor. The old man mused to himself as he pressed a button to the 7th floor where he wanted to go. The elderly man casually inquired of the woman, "What floor do you want to go to?" The woman replied in hushed tones that she wanted to go to the 6th floor. The old man easily assisted her in pressing the 6th floor. He assumed she was confused and had forgotten to press. As the elevator rose, the old woman said nothing and did not respond either, despite the fact that the old man asked a few questions. "The 6th floor has been vacant for many years and has been sold for many years. Are you the one who bought it?" Because the old man suspected she was a psycho, he paid no attention to her anymore. After a while, the elevator took the two of them to the 6th floor as the old woman had requested. However, the woman did not approach the elevator door, indicating that she did not intend to exit the elevator. The man returned to remind her not to miss the elevator again. "Aren't you going to the 6th floor? There, you have it." But this time the old man was taken aback. Something was wrong here. Behind him turned out to be empty and the woman vanished without a trace. There was only the old man in the elevator. Did she just vanish like this? This time terrified the old man. He had no idea what he was in for. Could it be that what he saw just now was a ghost? Just as the old man was becoming perplexed, the elevator door behind him slowly opened, indicating that something was abnormal. The old man looked back instinctively. He was also on the lookout for any unexpected situations that might arise. And the old man saw a dark figure rushing towards him. He had no idea what was going on. But as soon as he saw the figure clearly, he was terrified. He couldn't believe what he was seeing in front of him. It was an old woman with a hideous face, her skin rotting and revealing a grey color, and her body emitting a strong stench. The old lady with white eyes gaped at him with a cynical look. Her body was poured directly onto him, which terrified him. The old man collapsed to the ground in terror, and the woman also overpowered him. He was completely taken aback by what was happening. Wasn't this the old lady who just asked him to select the elevator button on the 6th floor? At the time, his reaction was perplexing. The old man had almost exhausted his remaining strength. From the other corner, the old woman's body was lying there, and he was leaning against the elevator's corner. He was terrified. But seeing the old woman's body lying on the ground, his legs were terrified and he couldn't stand up. However, he discovered another more terrible truth at this time. Because the old woman's body blocked the elevator door, preventing the elevator from running. With trembling hands, he quickly took out his cell phone and dialed his daughter's number, pleading for assistance. However, the signal in the elevator was very poor. He didn't remember how many times he called, but it appeared that he was unable to obtain the signal. His daughter worked as an office worker for a foreign invested company at the time. She knew her father was in distress after receiving the call, so she immediately dialed 911. 20 minutes later, the police arrived at the Tianxia building where the old man was trapped and were attempting to help him. However, when the police and rescue teams arrived, they saw the situation at the scene and it was helpless because so many things were intertwined. The cops used the old man's daughter's cell phone to contact him and wanted to save him as soon as possible, and there was only one way to do so. That was drag the decomposing old woman into the elevator and restart the elevator. The old man shivered when he realized he'd have to pull that horrible corpse by himself, but there was no other option. He thought the ghost of the old woman was beside him, so he just had to move this horrible rotting corpse? He had no idea what to do. However, he was unable to move or leave. He didn't want to spend another second with this body because it was getting dark. When the night came, if he was still present to keep this corpse and remain this closed elevator, a ghost might appear at any time. With this in mind, the elderly man closed his eyes and dragged the body into the elevator. The elevator finally started running after dragging the body into the elevator room, but as soon as the door closed, this terrible old man and woman were trapped in the cramped elevator. Still haunted by the sticky sensation of the old woman's rotting corpse, he looked around and found it deafeningly quiet. The entire world seemed to have vanished, leaving only the old man to guard the terrifying corpse. The elevator went down for a few minutes, and the old man felt like he'd been there for a century. Finally, the elevator descended to the 1st floor where the old woman's body was being handled by the rescue team below, and the old man collapsed before stepping out of the elevator with the assistance of his daughter. An investigation revealed that the old woman's body was identical to Mr. Lee's, who went missing 7 days ago. The police obtained surveillance footage of the entire building and revealed information about the incident. On July 14, Miss Lee, an elderly woman receiving care at a nursing home on the 5th floor, ghostly pressed a button to enter the elevator on the 6th floor. Miss Lee stepped out of the elevator after it reached the 6th floor in case no one noticed. The 6th floor was formerly a dojo, abandoned for unknown reasons for many years, recently sold to a new owner, who didn't know why, never used the place, so it remained empty. However, because the owner was concerned about other people entering, he welded a small iron cage to the elevator position. Miss Lee discovered that the elevator door at the back was closed after exiting the elevator. Because of the gap in this cage, she couldn't squat or lie down. She could only stand like this, and no one noticed she was trapped there. Following the autopsy, she died of dehydration. Perhaps the old man's discovery of her body was proof that the spirit can guide the way. This story happened in a residential area west of Liaoning City 8 years ago. That year, after graduating from technical school, I was assigned by school to work at a mechanical processing factory. That factory had an agreement with our school that would pay little salary for fresh graduates like us. At that time, we were in the category of interns because we didn't know much, so we had to let them use us. However, during that time, I met some good friends. When we had a rest on Sunday, we would gather to play games and have dinner together. That same day, my colleague Xin and Fang would come to Fi's house to cook and drink together. Fi's parents were away for a few days so we could have fun. We just walked to Fi's house and chatted happily. As we approached the gate, an older man with white hair walked past us. We didn't pay much attention to the older man's ugly appearance, but the moment he passed us, I actually smelled a strong, rotten smell. The smell was so unpleasant that it made people nauseous. It was like the smell of an animal that had been dead for more than 10 days with maggots. We all frowned at the older man. At that time, I thought it was strange. The older man was well dressed and had a nice figure, but why was he so smelly? Fi lived in the same neighborhood as the older man, and they were very familiar. When I inquired about the older man, Fi introduced us. The older man's age was younger than his appearance, but why he became like that, no one knew. This incident would certainly make people curious. There was an incident in his family, that's why he was so strange, Fi said. It turned out that the man's wife fell ill and passed away. Currently he lived with his son, who was our age. Although the house would not be complete without his wife, the older man worked hard every day because he had a son. He wanted to give his son a good life. But he would never have thought that one day the worst thing in his life would happen. It was a robbery and murder case. Although the case was solved and the killer was severely punished, his only son was never resurrected. The man's life suddenly fell apart because his only motivation for living was gone. Since then, the man quit his job and didn't go out anymore. The older neighbors were very sorry for that man. However, about a month after the death of the older man's son, residents discovered something strange. One day, two people nearby passed by the door of the older man's house and said, "A good family disappeared in the blink of an eye. Poor thing." Suddenly, they noticed that there were a lot of pamphlets posted outside the door, covering most of the plastered wall and giving off a burning smell. This thing at least showed that the man had not been out for a long time. The people around smelled rotten, so everyone suspected something was wrong. At first, everyone said nothing, but over time the smell became more and more severe, making it impossible for people to sit still. A few aunts and uncles in the neighborhood committee reported to the police. However, the police knew the older man became like this because his son was killed. At the same time, they also discovered that the older man did not have suicidal tendencies. But that aunt and uncle still decided to report to the police. The policemen thought for a long time because this was really important. It was not easy to break into someone's house without a superior's order. Probably because he didn't go out for a long time and didn't take out the trash. That caused a stench, the police said. Seeing that the police did not believe him, an uncle stepped in front of the crowd and told a strange thing he had seen in the day before. When this uncle was walking one night, he saw a man throwing trash around. The uncle approached and saw that the man was the older man near the house. In just a few days, the hair of the older man turned grey. The uncle barely recognized him. When the uncle saw the older man, he wanted to say hello and comfort the older man with a few words. But the older man reacted strangely. He turned and left without saying any word. This made the uncle find it very strange. In the past, this older man was often very enthusiastic. When he met everyone, he greeted everyone. Even if his family had a bad situation, he was always warm. The uncle turned his head and saw that the trash bag the older man had just thrown was even more stranger than usual. There was still a lot of blood on the bulging black bag, and there was still the same rotting smell coming from the older man's house. Was there something shady here? The uncle was frightened, stepped forward and tore the black bag open, wanting to see what was inside. This uncle was surprised because there were some dead crows inside. Some had just died, some had rotted and gave off a stench. This story made the uncle want to break his head because he did not understand. The uncle wondered if this older man was doing something shady. After hearing what the uncle said, the two policemen felt strange and finally decided to go to the older man's house to check. The uncle and the neighbor led the two policemen to arrive at the older man's house. The door seemed to have not been opened for a long time. The stench was strong. The police also thought it was odd and reached out and knocked on the door, but no matter how they called, no one answered and no one opened the door. At this time, the police also felt that things were not easy. Maybe something happened. The two policemen discussed whether to ask someone to open the door. They needed to see how things were going. At this moment, the door suddenly opened with a cluck, 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 cluck. It was a man who opened the door. His hair was now white, but when the policemen saw him, everyone was surprised. There was a lot of blood on the farmer's body. The older man kept his head down and said nothing about the police interrogation. The police were afraid of something serious, so they quickly restrained him first. They asked the older man to stand still and not to move to make sure he couldn't do anything. That uncle and aunt's neighbor were both around the door at the time. They were amazed when they looked inside the house. Then some policemen ran over and checked the older man's house. In the kitchen, the policemen found a lot of crows with bloodstains all over the kitchen. There was also a crow being slaughtered in a basin of water, blood everywhere. The body of the man's dead son was not cremated or buried but lay flat in his bedroom. The situation at the scene was strange, so the older man was taken to the police station. After many questions from the police, the older man finally spoke. After the death of his son, he was sad for a while, but then he heard someone say that if he drank the crow's blood for 81 days, he could bring the dead back to life. The method sounded cruel and unscientific, but he was eager to give it a try. The older man cried as he told the story and kept begging the police to let him go because his son couldn't stop drinking blood for a day. After listening to the police, everyone was speechless because he loved his son so much and could do anything to hope for his son to come back to life. Because crows were not considered a protected animal and disposing of dead family members was not mandatory, the police released him. After hearing Fee recount that older man's story, my first reaction was to feel sorry for that man. However, Fee said that the people who entered the older man's house that day spread the rumor throughout the entire surrounding area. These people said that although his son had been dead for nearly 2 months, the body had not decomposed and the hair was still growing. As for whether the rumors were true or not, we didn't know either. Later, my family arranged for me to work in a factory in Jiangsu. I left my hometown. I didn't know if that older man's son would come back to life. Fee said that the older man suddenly moved out and no one knew where he went. This story happened in Longan District, Huludao City, Liaoning Province on December 10, 2015. I was working at a harbor there at the time. My colleagues and I lived together in a dormitory not far from the harbor. There was an abandoned building next to our dormitory. One day, the three of us had a little drink after work. Yin, the bravest of the three, came up with the idea that we would explore the abandoned building. He said that the abandoned building used to be the office of a large company. Normally, we would object, but because we were drunk that day, the ghost somehow made the two of us follow Yin. But when we got there, we both regretted it. If the building looked somber during the day, it was even scarier at night. Another colleague of mine was Sam, who was not very big but very brave. Sam wanted us to go back, however, despite Yin's ridicule and irony that Sam was a coward, Sam still decided to continue, and I didn't have any opinions of my own. Although I was a little scared, I didn't fall far behind when the two of them were walking. After entering the abandoned building, we realized that there was indeed a fire before, and there were traces of smoke everywhere. It was very dark inside the house. We relied on the light from the mobile phone in Yin's hand to shine, looked at some of the rooms inside, but were quite disappointed. The rooms were empty. They seemed to have been cleaned up after the fire, but nothing was left. At this point, we decided to go out. Yin was thinking about something. He saw several houses in front of him that did not appear to be on fire. He also saw some items that were kept and asked to check them out. There were indeed some things in the rooms, but they were all shabby furniture. They hadn't been used in years. There was a smaller corridor in front of some rooms. We decided to go down that road. Sam convinced us to come back, but Yin ignored him, and Sam didn't dare to go out alone, so he had to follow. At the door of a room, Yin suddenly stopped as if something inside caught his attention. Sam and I followed Yin together and looked inside. We saw a person in the corner sleeping with a tattered duvet, looking like a homeless person. But slowly we all discovered something was wrong. The person didn't show any reaction, especially the bare feet with a dead grey color. Yin felt curious and wanted to go ahead and see if the person was alive or dead. "I'll see if the person is dead or not," Yin said. "Don't be so crazy," I tried to stop him. We both convinced Yin not to check that person because we might get in trouble, but Yin had a very stubborn character. The more we tried to stop him, the more he wanted to do it. Finally, he stepped forward and opened the tattered duvet. This moment made our hearts feel like jumping out because no one knew if it was a corpse or a living person. But as soon as the duvet was opened, we were all scared. It was a dead wanderer. The body was rotting. It could be seen that he had been dead for some time. His skin was dry and disfigured. Seeing the horrible appearance of the corpse, Sam went to the back and vomited in disgust. I also hid far away, not daring to look directly. But Yin was brave, not afraid at all, mocking us for cowardice. Not only did he not leave, he even ran to the corpse and asked Sam to take a photo of him with the corpse. At first, Sam disagreed, but seeing Yin's appearance as if he wouldn't leave, he didn't take a photo. Sam had no choice but to take a photo for him. Yin didn't stop, and he asked to take a few more pictures before leaving in the end. Yin was completely satisfied, and we hurried back to the dormitory. Honestly, when I arrived there I wasn't so scared, but now that I knew there was a dead man in the building behind our dormitory, I was so scared. The way back became very scary. I always felt that there were ghosts following me. Fortunately, we all made it home safely. The thrilling adventure of the night had ended safely. After the horrible night last night, we all went to work as usual. At noon, Sam suddenly panicked and ran into my office with a panicked face. He said that Yin didn't come to work this morning. His phone was unreachable. Yin was keeping a piece of material that Sam was in urgent need of right now. Sam was very thoughtful, feeling that this must have been something to do with what happened last night. He asked me to go with him to the abandoned building. Ever since we saw the dead man last night, we had been terrified of this abandoned building, but I found Yin and it was daytime, so we still dared to come here. Following memory, we followed the path we took last night and began to look for Yin. Honestly, I didn't know why. Even during the day, this building looked so dark and spooky. The two of us took the road that we went on last night. Soon we reached the dead wanderer room and we looked inside, trembling. We immediately saw the tattered duvet covering the dead, but we also realized that it was different from last night. The overhanging shape of the duvet obviously didn't cover one more person, and a bad premonition arose in both of us. Although Sam was very scared, he and Yin were both from the same hometown and knew each other before. He was worried about Yin, so he dared to remove the torn tattered duvet. But as soon as we opened it, we were both completely dumbfounded. Sure enough, Yin was already dead under the duvet. He died next to the rotting corpse of the Wanderer. No one knew why Yin came here or how he died. Sam and I couldn't imagine anything anymore. Later, the police came to handle the body and concluded that Yin died of sudden heart failure, but Sam and I understood that Yin's death stemmed from a lack of respect for the deceased. The story happened in 2014 near Rongbuk Monastery in Tingri District, Zigazi District, Tibet Autonomous Region. Some people in our climbing group were frustrated with nature, so they tried to help each other go under the guidance of a local guide. We started down the mountain. Unlike the previous uphill with high confidence, the downhill road this time was extremely long and rough. When we reached the campsite, the three of us collapsed on the ground almost at the same time from fatigue. "We are safe now. I will find someone to help," said the tour guide. Fang, a local Tibetan guide, was trying to comfort us with a few words and then went to find someone to help us notify the rescue team at the foot of the mountain. Looking back on this climb, I still had feared. There were 4 people on our team, all members of the Chamber of Commerce. We all liked outdoor sports. We were always ready to conquer anywhere with a sparse population and harsh environment. Mount Everest was our common desire, but we did not expect that the event of conquering the top of the world would end this way. 2 days ago, we passed by Rongbuk Monastery's Everest base camp. We chose the climbing path by ourselves and started towards the holy land of Mount Everest. At that time, we were filled with confidence, and we felt that we were able to conquer anything on this mountaintop. At this time, our team leader was Ming, a captain with the most successful business and the most adventurous spirit in us. "Hurry up!" He always encouraged people like that. I must say that under Min's leadership throughout the journey, we have made good progress, overcome many difficulties and dangers. Everything had gone very smoothly. But maybe our luck has ran out. The sacred snow mountain had not finally taken care of ignorant people like us. When Ming was climbing an ice cliff, his climbing gear fell off because the ice broke. Ming had no support at all, suddenly slipped and fell. The gap between 2 snow-covered mountains was hundreds of meters high, extremely dark below. We were about 20 meters away from Ming at that time. and we couldn't save him. We could only watch him disappear into the dark. Several of us were dumbfounded as we watched him disappear. When we were planning our trip to Mount Everest, we all promised to do well, but when Ming's sudden death appeared in front of us like this, we didn't dare to face it. We did not have the ability and courage to find and rescue Ming, so we had to retreat to the rest station on the mountainside yesterday warily. After Ming's accident, I once again looked up at the snow-capped mountains in front of me. It was no longer sacred as before, but full of mystery, majesty, and fear. We reported the accident to the local search and rescue team and waited 2 days at the rest station for someone to guide us down the mountain. Unexpectedly, the result after much waiting was that the search and rescue team had not yet found Ming's body due to the harsh weather and geography. Honestly, we also knew many people died and went missing on that snow-capped mountain, but if we wanted to give up like this and leave him here, we really couldn't. If you guys want to find him, I have a way to try. At this time, Fang, the old Tibetan guide, suddenly told us that he had one way, but this way was a secret technique in Tibet. Facing the snow-covered mountains with no clue, we had no choice but to agree to trust the experienced older man. We found no help but to believe in Fang. He carried a basket full of cow dung and a black ceramic jar in his hand and went up the mountain alone. Next, 2 long days of waiting, we were all hoping and looking forward to Fang. During these 2 days, we analyzed the ability of an older man like Fang to find Ming's body, and the conclusion we got was not optimistic at all. Not to mention, the older man couldn't go down into the deep gorge to find Ming without advanced climbing equipment. Moreover, the things he carried weren't of any help. However, we also knew that anything was possible in the mystical Tibet region. Those who visited Tibet had less understanding of the mysterious land in Tibet than the experience of the people living here. At this moment, we suddenly heard footsteps outside. We were sitting by the window and looking out. It turned out that Fang was back, and behind him there was another person. Looking at that man's equipment, it turned out that Ming had not died yet. When we saw Ming follow behind Fang, we were all glad that he wasn't dead yet. We were all excited to run out of the camp. But I didn't know how this was possible because I had seen Ming fall off the cliff. Not to mention, Ming was in the mountains for 5 days without supplies. Although it was unbelievable, the truth was in front of us. We were still eagerly waiting for Ming's return. But when we got closer and saw Ming, everyone's mood dropped again. How could he be alive when the bruised face of a dead person has appeared? His whole body was full of cracked purple wounds. But even though we asked, Fang, the older man, didn't reply to us. His mysterious attitude intrigued us all. At this moment, I saw him take out a Tibetan blanket from the camp and spread it flat on the ground. Then he drew some cryptic handprints on Ming's face and pushed them back. At this time, Ming completely fell back, directly lying on the Tibetan blanket. Fang took off all Ming's clothes and found another Tibetan blanket to cover him. I knew this was the ultimate Tibetan respect for corpses. When Fang took out a piece of camel meat from the small black jar he carried with him, then we heard him say that the camel meat was soaked with special herbs. Fang lifted a piece of camel meat over his head and circled Ming's body 3 times, chanting continuously. Then he squatted down, bringing the piece of camel meat close to the nose and mouth of Ming's body. At first, we didn't understand what he was up to, but about a minute later we saw a strange bulge in Ming's throat. Ming's throat was constantly twisting, getting longer and longer, getting closer and closer to his mouth. Something seemed to be about to crawl out of his neck. Right after that, 2 tentacle-like things protruded from Ming's mouth. We were all shocked by this horrible and mysterious sight before our eyes. We were speechless. Slowly, a big red bug crawled out of the mouth of Ming. It was a thing we had never seen before. The worms followed Fang and the camel meat, then crawled into the black jar. Then Fang tightly covered the mouth of the jar. Seeing that Fang had completed the ritual, we realized that Ming's body was able to move thanks to that creepy bug and that strange secret technique. The matter was over. Ming's body was brought back to his hometown. I didn't know how many people were still dreaming about the snowy mountain Mecca, because it had many mysteries. It happened in 1996 in a small city in Hong Kong. This story was also a famous strange case at that time. Mr. Ma was a security guard at an old apartment building. Evenings were always his best time. Because it was summer, the day was very hot and muggy, but the night was cooler and more pleasant. There was nothing better than sitting in the wind and drinking a glass of wine. After placing the pot of fragrant lamb stew on the table, Mr. Ma was very happy and refreshed, so he poured a glass of wine and was ready to sip. But suddenly something fell from above very quickly and directly into his mutton pot. The broth and even the lamb was splattered all over the table, which greatly annoyed Mr. Ma. He didn't know who could be so careless, blatantly throwing trash down, so he looked up and started cursing. But there was absolutely no movement above. Everything was still quiet. No one answered him. He thought they must be afraid of being scolded by Mr. Ma, so they deliberately ignored him. But just a few minutes later, from the fourth floor, something suddenly fell again, which was black and slightly round. Thinking that the other person would continue to throw trash on the ground, Mr. Ma was very attentive to what was falling to catch the other guy. However, the thing that fell was something he couldn't believe, because it was a human head. It flew from above very quickly. This thing made him panic. He had never encountered a situation like this before. The head fell straight onto the table, hitting Mr. Ma's pot of lamb, sending everything flying everywhere. He was also surprised to the point of immobilization. At this point, Mr. Ma could only watch the mess in front of him, his eyes white with fear. The head belonged to a woman. Because of blood loss, her skin had turned pale. Next to the head was a human hand, so it was clear that what had fallen before was a human hand. At this point, Mr. Ma wanted to run away, but his legs were numb. So, he backed up and fell back and still staring at the head on the table. In the end, Mr. Ma gathered all his strength to scream out loud to everyone for help. After Mr. Ma's screams, everyone gathered and called the police. The police car was present at the scene where the head fell within minutes. Hearing Mr. Ma's statement, the police began to surround the room to prepare to arrest the perpetrator. But when standing in front of the room, the policeman suddenly saw something very strange. That's the door to the room that didn't close. It's still open. Could the killer have run away? If not, he probably didn't know what fear was. However, the policemen were also very cautious. They stood by the door and peered inside the room through the half-open door. But what was inside made them suddenly startled. The strong smell of blood gushing out from inside the dark room with only a little light. A man was sitting on the sofa with a gloomy expression, surrounded by blood, stretching from the wall to his clothes to the floor. On the floor was a large knife. The type used to cut meat was also lying in a pool of blood. It seemed that this was the weapon that the man used to kill people. The policeman stood in front of him, even pointed a gun at his head to control him, but he still did not resist or explain anything. His eyes were empty and lifeless, his face dark and extremely sad. It was worth mentioning that he kept staring at the TV without blinking. Something was attracting him more than the fact that he had just killed someone. The strangest thing was that there were no programs on TV. So what was he looking at? And what made him like that? The TV continued to make squeaks, and the screen was only filled with black and white dots as if the signal was lost. The police then went looking for clues around the house. They discovered the body of a woman without a head sitting in the kitchen. This must be the body of the head that had fallen on Mr. Ma's table. Inside the bedroom was the body of a boy, about 10 years old, whose head was also beheaded, but his head was left not far away, not thrown out. Because this case shocked the people and the press, the police couldn't take it lightly. They immediately set up a team to investigate everything. The man was also taken to the police station to get a bow. His face remained the same, still wide open eyes and gloomy. After interrogation, what the police received was only a statement that the devil had made him. He did not know what he had just done. But of course, the police did not believe it. The police wanted him to tell everything because there was no such thing as being manipulated by the devil, like he said. He also began to recount everything that night. He had no reason to kill his wife and son. It was a day off for the couple, so they both took their son out to play. Then the whole family returned home just after dark. Arriving at home, everyone was tired. The wife decided to go to the kitchen to cut some fruit and bring it to the living room so that the whole family could watch TV while resting. The son went straight to the bedroom to play, and he just sat in the living room watching TV, waiting for his wife. On TV was showing a program excavating ancient tombs, was also a popular program recently. But for a while the TV suddenly blurred and the sound also started to crack. It seemed that the signal was lost. After that, the image of the other program also disappeared completely, replaced by black and white dots and shrill squeaks. But in that squeak it seemed to be a whispering voice, telling the man to kill his family and cut off their heads. And for some reason his mind went blank, and then his body began to do what the voice commanded. Just like that, he killed his family exactly the way the voice on the television said. He did not understand why he did it, but at that time he was no longer aware of anything. Hearing this, of course, the policeman would not believe it. There was no way that a strange voice coming from the TV could command someone to kill people like that. Perhaps he had a long quarrel with his wife, or he was an abuser. The investigation lasted nearly a month, but no matter what method the police used, he only gave one way, the same answer. No matter how menacing or soft-spoken, the man was still the same, and he seemed to be very sure of his words. The police also reached out to neighbors and people who knew him to investigate, but according to the results, he had no reason to kill his family. Their whole family lived together very happily. Everyone knew it. But among the neighbors' testimonies, many said strange things had happened recently, since some people had unearthed an ancient tomb near this area. The people believed that perhaps it has accidentally released something bad or a curse of some kind. Of course, the police wouldn't take out those stories to write about the case because the husband himself admitted to killing his family. So he couldn't defend him for such spiritual reasons. Finally, he was sentenced to death for his cruel behavior. And whether the truth was what he told or not, no one would ever know. It took place in 1983 in a small village north of Jiangzhou, China. Lu and his father, Mr. Yang, were worriedly walking around outside their house. Mr. Yang felt strange in his heart when he saw his son so nervous, so he constantly comforted him. "Mei is in good health. There will be no issue." However, Lu's nervousness was not unusual given that he and his wife Mei had been married for 7 years but had no children. The entire family, including the elderly father who had been waiting for their daughter-in-law Mei to become pregnant, and the time had finally come for her to give birth. And the midwife went into the room all morning and still didn't see anything, so the father tried to comfort his son, telling him to calm down and not to worry too much. Finally, near noon, there were children's cries from inside the house, which delighted Lu and the old father. Hearing the child's cry, everything seemed to become more beautiful and stronger, and the hearts of both the True's family, father and son, seemed to burst with joy as a result of happiness. After 10 minutes, the door opened and Sen, the midwife, stepped out. "Aunt Sen, is our child born?" Lu inquired cheerfully. They were speechless when they learned that Mei had given birth to their first fat son, and Lu was as happy as if he had caught gold. Miss Sen had been a midwife her entire life, and she knew that while Lu was not young, he was a first-time father, so she advised him not to be too hasty and to keep the child's mother from going out in the wind. Lu was so excited that he didn't listen to what Miss Sen said next and ran into the house to see his wife and children. With joy-like celebration, Miss Yang finally had a grandson. He prepared a large red envelope for Miss Sen. However, after a few sentences, the old lady Sen pushed open the red envelope and hurriedly left. "Remember to keep the windows closed at night when giving something for the baby and mom to nourish their bodies." As he watched her rush out of the house, Mr. Yang wondered in his heart, was there something wrong? However, the family and Lu, who were now surrounded by the newborn and Mei, quickly dismissed these minor concerns. Everyone was concerned about Mei's health because this was her first child, and everyone was overjoyed to see their first grandson. Lu used to lose his temper a lot because Mei couldn't have children, but now he appeared to be extremely happy with everyone, and he always had a smile on his face. The child had grown stronger and stronger with the help of every family member, and Mei's body had also recovered. But on the night the baby was born, the moon was very full and something strange happened. The couple was sleeping with their baby in their arms one night. Lu and Mei were fast asleep. Mei was startled awake by the baby's cry, which sounded very eerie and strange, and it was frightening. Mei initially assumed it was her son who had awoken in the middle of the night crying. She didn't know if the child was hungry or in pain. But when she opened her eyes, her son was soundly sleeping next to her. But the crying continued in waves and didn't stop. Mei considered getting up to listen more carefully, but her body appeared to be pressed by a heavy object, rendering her temporarily immobile. Immediately following that, Mei felt a small black shadow crawling over her. She was not sure if it was a dream or not. Mei couldn't move, but she could roll her eyes down and see a baby crawling on top of her. The child appeared to have been born recently, but the entire body was grey, with a few blue veins on the head, and it appeared very frightening. What was more terrifying was that the child had a mouth, and it was covered in layers of sharp little teeth. He was a child from hell. The child gradually climbed onto May's chest, eventually removing her shirt and biting her nipple. Her chest was painfully pierced by the small fangs the infant was sucking. May had now no idea how long the baby had been sucking milk violently like a demon, and she had gradually lost consciousness. May didn't wake up until the next morning. Everything that happened last night was dreadful. May still had a lingering fear from last night's horrifying scene. She thought it was a nightmare, but the dream was too real. Lou awoke some time ago, desperately clutching the child on the ground. What happened? It was strange because their son had been so healthy since birth. He had never cried before, and no one knew what made him cry so hard. Fearing that Lou was clumsy and didn't know how to care for the baby, May got out of bed and continued to care for her son. But the child kept crying, and he kept crying louder and louder, making May impatient and heartbroken for the little child. The child's grandmother was wise and knew that the baby would not cry for no reason, so she advised the couple to closely monitor the baby. However, when the tiny duvet was opened, even elderly people such as the baby's grandmother were taken aback. It was red and swollen on their son's fragile neck, with small holes in the same place. They appeared to have been bitten by small teeth. When May saw this wound, she immediately remembered a nightmare from the night before. She told her mother and Lou about her ordeal last night. After she finished speaking, she felt a slight pain in her chest. When she opened her shirt, she discovered a row of tiny teeth marks. Hadn't she had a dream last night? Didn't the child's grandmother immediately recognize the newborn ghost, as the old people in the countryside used to say? She stated that in rural areas, if a newborn dies, it cannot be buried or burned. Instead, most of them are found in the open field and discarded. It was claimed that these children had suffered too many injustices and that they must be exposed to the sun in an open area to be exonerated. However, some dead babies were born in clouds, moons, and stars, and because these places were rich in yin, they became a kind of newborn ghost, carrying heavy resentment. This type of newborn ghost harbored a deep resentment. They relied solely on nature to find milk everywhere, infecting young mothers who had recently given birth nearby. According to May, she was targeted by an infant ghost. At the time, she had just given birth. When she noticed that the couple was both scared, she quickly said something else so that they wouldn't be too concerned. They followed the child's grandmother to the deserted grasslands west of the village, where children's bodies were frequently dumped. Surely a dead child was thrown nearby, she said, and that child had turned into a ghost infant, and we could tell them apart. Lou and his father spent the night in the grasslands, where they discovered a dead child lying alone on the moor. The features on the dead child's face were hideous and frightening, and his mouth was still stained with blood. The Yang family's father and son couldn't bear what it had done to their children and grandchildren, so they went out and found a lot of wood and placed it on the ghost child. Following that, a fire burned that horrifying ghost child, who appeared to be very frightening. The newborn ghost never appeared again. Lou's son stopped crying, but the baby's body was always a little weak and sick, which the grandmother attributed to the nun's mother's collision. Later, with the help of the midwife Sen, they learned how to better care for the child, and that dreadful story was never told again. Miss Sen also stated that she recently gave birth to a child for a family in a neighboring village, but the child died shortly after birth. Miss Sen recognized this as a bad omen, but no one believed this and did not expect the dead child to actually become a newborn ghost.